Well, hello and welcome to Living on the Edge. This is the first event in this year's Two Rivers Book Festival. Two Rivers runs for a week, and this is actually our only online event. We've got lots of stuff going on. We've got noir fiction in Great Yarmouth. We've got romance and rebellion in near Diss. We've got book publishing and festivals in Lowestoft. And next weekend, there's a day or so of book talk in Halesworth, Victorian letters, surviving war, espionage and peacetime, and town hauntings. And all this comes from Waveney and Blythe Arts. The details of Waveney and Blythe Arts and about the Two Rivers Book Festival you'll find on waveneyandblythearts.com. But right now we've got three accomplished authors and a challenging theme. And they'll be introduced by our chair for this event, Claire Armitstead. Claire is The Guardian's Associate Editor, brackets, Culture. And behind that title lies 20 years of dealing with books, arts, theatre, and more at the paper. But also judging, chairing, and generally gracing events like this all around the world. So we're very lucky and grateful to have her here tonight. Claire.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Brian. It's a pleasure to do this, particularly because it's a subject I've been thinking about for the last 2 years. And it's a rather sad story, in fact, that I started to think about it at the 2018 Hay Festival. And then for various reasons, the piece got put on hold, and the piece that I wrote for The Guardian resurfaced just recently. And one of the people I interviewed was Jessie. And I'm really, but I think in that 2-year period, actually, the climate did really change. So in a way, I was lucky that it took that long. It did mean that I had to read several sets of books because, as anyone who's familiar with publishing will know, books come and go very quickly. So something that seems very hot and topical in September of one year, by next April, it's sort of last year's dead wood, and you have to then have a whole different lot of reference points. But what it does mean is that I have read a huge amount of fiction relating to this theme. And before I introduce the three speakers, I want to just open with two quotes, which have been sort of cornerstones for me in this project. And one is from Amitav Ghosh, who's the great Bengali writer, who set off a big discussion with a pamphlet he wrote called The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable, which was published back in 2016. And Amitav, those who don't know him, he was born and spends a lot of his time in Calcutta, and where one of the world's great rainforests is called the Sundarbans, and his fiction has often, going way back, has dealt with the Sundarbans and the sort of mythology and the ecology of it. And it's one of the rainforests that is very threatened at the moment for all the reasons that the rest of the world is threatened. Anyway, Amitav in the Great Derangement talked about, wondered why he couldn't actually directly look climate change in the eye. And this is what he said: "I've come to recognize that the challenges that climate change poses for the contemporary writer, though specific in some respects, are also products of something broader and older, that they derive ultimately from the grid of literary forms and conventions that come to shape the narrative imagination in precisely that period when the accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere was rewriting the destiny of the earth." And I mean, it's an utterly resonant and haunting paragraph, which I've carried with me ever since I read that. And I think it's a good starting point to bear in mind for this discussion. And the second quote comes from Jessie Greengrass, who's one of our panelists. Amazing, newish. I suppose that's even the High House isn't actually new now, exactly new now. Climate crisis novel, The High House, and I think that she sums up something that has changed almost in the 2 years since Amitav wrote, the 4 year, in fact it's 4 years since, 5 years since 2016, since Amitav wrote that sentence. And Jessie's sentence is, paragraph is the whole complicated system of modernity which had held us up away from the earth was crumbling, and we were becoming again what we had used to be, cold and frightened of the weather and frightened of the dark. Somehow, while we'd all been busy, while we'd all been doing those small things which added up to living, the future had slipped into the present. So now I'm going to, with those two quotes ringing in your ears, I'm going to introduce our panelists. Jessie Greengrass, who arrived with The High House. It's her second novel, but she's also published, as she is very keen for me to tell you, a collection of short stories. I can't actually see you, Jessie. Where have you gone?
I'm here.
Oh, you're here. You're here. The High House is the story of a family who have found themselves in a house which has not suffered a global inundation because it's high, as it's high up in land, as its title would suggest. And Jessie will tell us a little bit more about it in a minute. Next up is Niall Bourke, whose first novel, Line, I discovered by chance when I was doing the last parts of research for this book. And we will have to have a chat about what this novel is, whether it is actually a climate change novel. But I was incredibly struck by it, because one of the things I've been thinking about is the forms of literature that can address this. And it strikes me that Niall has worked an extraordinary trick by harnessing two very different stories together. And in the first part of it, I mean, it's sort of difficult even to talk about because one worries about plot spoilers, but Niall, I'm sorry, I'm going to talk about it. First story is a migrant story in a desert land where there is nothing that isn't provided by airdrop, by some mysterious force. And then the two characters find a completely different reality, which we'll go on to talk about. Actually, I'm not going to give away quite yet what that other reality is. And it's in that second half, it's been described as like steampunk Cormac McCarthy. There's a definition for you, Niall. I expect you had fun with that one.
Yeah.
So third to go is Ben Smith's Doggerland, which was actually the first of these novels to be published, and I believe came out of, am I right in it came out of this festival in some way? It came out of a discussion did it come out of a discussion about Doggerland? Is that right?
No, it was actually just something I've been working on for a number of years beforehand.
It wasn't anything to do with Julia Blackburn's book about?
No, that was complete chance, actually. We both ended up having books on Doggerland out in the same year.
Right.
And we both thought it was such a weird, esoteric topic that nobody else would be stupid enough to write a book about Doggerland. And then both of us had books out in the same year. So
yeah, and funnily enough, this big epic that I was writing about climate change. It started off about Julia's Doggerland, because what she did, blending fiction and non-fiction, seemed to be the only possible answer at that stage to this sort of momentous subject. And then, blow me down, along comes your novel, which also deals with this particular piece of land. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by talking a little bit to each of you to your particular novels, because I don't suppose everybody in this room, and welcome to you all, will know all of the novels, and then we'll talk among ourselves for a while, and then we will have 15 minutes at the end for questions, at least 15 minutes. If you want to ask a question, what we're suggesting is you say what the subject of your question is in the chat box. You don't have to write out your whole question, but just say you want to ask a question and what the subject is, and then I'll pick you. And I'm a very informal chair. I'd like it to be as sort of informal and as sort of creative as possible. So do please pile in there. So let's start with Jessie, The High House. It's you wrote this novel, as you told me at the time, just when you'd moved north, and your research. Tell us a little bit about the research you put into this scenario.
So we'd recently moved from London to Northumberland, although I also spent quite a lot of time as a child in East Anglia, in various kind of coastal bits of East Anglia, and my grandfather has always lived and worked on the water, and I used to spend a lot of time with him. So I think the very, very earliest idea was that I was interested in the fact that the life that he described to me felt like it had been very much forgotten. I mean, it's recent, like it's, obviously living memory, he's still alive, but that way of life and the things that he knew have kind of been forgotten, not just in that they're no longer used, but also it seemed that their very existence and the very existence of that kind of life had been forgotten. So I started reading about about sort of rivers and fishing, and then I began to read more about. So then I suppose I began to get more frightened about climate change, and I began to read more about flooding, and in particular the flood in the 50s in the East Anglia flood, the North Sea surge, and I also was reading about sort of similar cataclysmic events here, and obviously they weren't kind of globally disastrous, but they were events that kind of, in terms of the communities that they happened to, caused sort of enormous suffering, but also kind of change. So just north of us, there's a town called Eyemouth, and there was a fishing disaster there where 2/3 of the fleet was lost in a single day, and it took then about a century for the population of the town to recover.
This is north of where you are now, or north of you in East Anglia?
No, north of now. So I'm in Berwick upon Tweed. So it's the next town up. So it's just over the Scottish border.
Yeah,
and still has one of the last remnants of the Scottish fishing industry going strong.
But the novel is nevertheless set in East Anglia.
Well, I mean, it's
sort of, is it?
Sort of. Bits of this and bits of that. Yeah, I mean, it's set somewhere that is liable to flood. So that part of it is very much East Anglian.
Yeah, and you have in it your characters are two girls and a younger brother, and their survival is they're sort of like smallholders, because but they're not smallholders because you've cheated, haven't you?
Well, yeah, because because that's the other thing that I did. I read a lot about crofting. I read an extraordinary book called Nightfalls on Ardnamurchan, which is set on the west coast. It's about the last days of crofting on the west coast of Scotland. And the thing that it made very clear was that, in fact, the idea that you can exist by yourself without any kind of community at all is it's impossible. You can't. I mean, or at least it's impossible to do it for very long. You can't kind of sustain yourself enough. You run out of resources. You run out of building material. You run out of time, because if a wall of your house falls down, you then have to choose whether you're going to continue to farm the land or rebuild the wall of your house, because you can't do both. And if you don't have enough food, obviously then you don't have enough energy, like physically, to rebuild your house. And so that then I became really interested in this idea that people think that you can somehow build yourself a bunker and then you're just going to survive. Like that you can survive long enough for what to happen. I don't know. So it seemed very important coming out of that the characters in the book are aware that while what they have is to some extent an arc, it's not one that is going to carry them into an endless future. It is time limited. They have survived to some extent.
And they have a barn stocked thoughtfully by the scientist stepmother, with things like trainers and tins of food. Trainers that the little boy obviously is going to grow into, things that I found that really touched me, the idea that actually, of course, he wouldn't have shoes. He would have.
Yeah, and I mean it's and the more that I kind of began to think about that, the more limited their lives became. So I sort of so someone kind of said about my book. There's a bit where they're trying to make bread and all they've got is like yeast from a packet that's really old, and also some really terrible wheat that they've grown and then ground, and the bread's horrible, and they all remember how nice bread used to be, you know. And someone said, well, they could just have sourdough. But the thing with sourdough is that you have to keep the culture going, and that means you have to have an amount of wheat every day just in order to keep your yeast culture alive. You can't just kind of decide to make one loaf of sourdough as and when you want to. And in order to have that amount of wheat, you then have to have the infrastructure to grow a year's supply of wheat for 4 people, which is a huge amount, and takes kind of labour and water and harvesting, you know. And then you don't have time for anything else. So now you've got loaves of bread, but you haven't got you haven't got anything else.
Yeah, great, lovely. Okay, we'll park you there and move on to Neil. Neil, line. I've only talked about the first part of it, which actually is extraordinarily recognisable from now. These queues of refugees waiting in deserts.
Yeah.
But they know not what.
When I was writing it over a kind of long period, I write very slowly, and like the migrant crisis, you know, was in the news all the time, percolating away, and then you like had that horrible poster, you know, the Farage poster of everyone queuing up like they're trying to come in and, I don't know, take over the country or something. So all this imagery, I think, was in there and was kind of shaping the barrenness of the landscape. It was kind of percolating down through me, you know, filtering through the news and into the book. But one thing I was kind of interested in, and this is interesting, you said, is it a climate novel or not? I think it's quite interesting because it was kind of the economic aspect of the migrant crisis. Like you had this kind of situation where you had like the outsourcing of border. Everyone was trying to push their borders further out, so it was someone else's problem. And then, you know, you had money being sent to Turkey to keep migrants there and not let them in, and all this was being then kind of used nefariously in the rhetoric at home. So it was kind of the fact that like the human situation is very including the climate, is very interlinked with the economics system that's kind of upholding it, and they're inextricably linked. You can't unpick them. Like kind of one thing informs the other thing. And I think we're seeing that with the climate at the minute. You know, everyone agrees, is climate getting worse? Yes. Should we do something about it? Yes. But it's going to cost money. So it's very hard to sell, right, you have to suffer monetary ills for 50 years so someone else can have a better earth. Everyone like is kind of on one level saying, yeah, but then when it happens, they're like, oh yeah, but not me. You know, and I think that was, what I was trying to get at in the book. It's the melding of those two, the human and the economic systems, I think.
And then you do this very, very sort of radical thing, which you take them on a journey, your 2 central characters who've fallen in love, away from this queue to the controlling reality. It's like they've gone through the mirror in the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, it's a bit of a break. It's quite interesting. Some people really like that, and some people are like, what? This is another book, what's going on here? Which is kind of what I wanted in a way, because I kind of wanted the book to be quite jarring and, you know, quite pushing the boundaries, because I think it kind of had to be to deal with the subject matter that I was trying to deal with. But again, even when they go to that otherworldly place, it's kind of, I think economics is at the forefront. It's an economic system that's kind of gone a bit mad, gone to an extreme. And one thing that kind of inspired me was a Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift, where he takes this kind of utilitarian argument and he extrapolates it to this absurd premise. But it's kind of absurd, but it kind of isn't. Like if you don't draw the line on it somewhere. And I was kind of inspired by that, trying to take a kind of current line of thinking and then like exacerbate it out to something a bit like surreal and ridiculous, and kind of see. Sorry. No, go on.
It's an extreme metaphor in a way for the Anthropocene, isn't it? The idea that actually we're now in a planet that's being driven by humanity is a new ecological force. We are what is driving the system. It doesn't exist outside us, you know. It doesn't. We're not being pushed around anymore. We are pushing everything around.
We are, and you see this around with the phrase "the economy." Like you see politicians say, "Oh, the economy," whatever. It's like the economy. The economy is basically just a measure of how we spend money, and it's kind of transcended and become its own thing. It's uncoupled from the people who make it. So, like the same thing. like it's an entity of itself. So it's like this thing that we've created has become this entity of itself that is controlling us. So yeah, absolutely.
Okay, off you go to the parking lot now.
Right.
And we'll come to Ben. Thank you, Ben, for being so patient. So
there's loads of fascinating stuff being said.
Oh, so interesting, isn't it? I know. I hope everybody's keeping notes of it, and we'll come back to all the elements of it. Doggerland in your novel sort of still doesn't exist as a visible thing, does it? It's bits that are fished out of the sea over what was once Doggerland. Talk a little bit about why you particularly fixated on Doggerland.
Yeah, it's, I mean, two reasons really. So Doggerland, for those who don't know, is the name given to the area of land that once connected Britain with continental Europe and was flooded at the end of the last ice age to form what's now the North Sea and the English Channel. So any of you who are here joining this from Waveney and Blythe, look out to sea. That's Doggerland, basically. And I was interested in this place, and I've been sort of trying to write about it for years. I originally did my PhD in poetry, and I've been trying to write poems about it, and they were awful, so I kind of parked those for a while. But I was interested in this place because this was the last time, at the end of the last ice age, when major climate change and flooding particularly affected human beings. So it was the last kind of time where our landscape changed in the way that scientists believe that it is going to change over the next 100, 200 years if we don't do something very quickly. So I'd been wanting to write about this place for some time, and then I guess it must have been about 2013, something like that. I read a newspaper article about this huge wind farm that was being built on Doggerland. So the last bit of Doggerland to flood is what's now Dogger Bank. So it's a relatively shallow area of sea. So they're building this huge wind farm there. And this is an amazing place. I mean, the plans for it's being built at the moment and will take years to complete, but it's several thousand square miles, thousands of wind turbines. It's the size of a small country. You just mentioned the Anthropocene, and that this idea that humans are changing the world at this kind of level. I've become fascinated by kind of Anthropocene landscapes, and wind farms to me felt like one of those places. And so I just kind of thought about that and thought about these wind turbines being built on this place, and just thought, well, what would happen there then, as a setting for a novel? So that was really where it came from, just the idea that what would happen if you set a novel there? How might that go? What stories could come out of this place?
And the story you've chosen to tell is the story. It's a real chamber piece with three characters: an old man, a boy who isn't a boy, you say at the beginning, and a pilot. And the pilot is their contact with the outside world, a sort of mysterious character who comes in, who knows things and brings things and trades. Why did you choose this particular setup?
I mean, I always have a tendency, I think, probably towards minimalism. So if you can get away with fewer characters, I kind of tend to go for that. I love writers like Cormac McCarthy, and I love Beckett. And I like, thinking about Beckett as a kind of, a writer of climate change. There's a wonderful essay by the eco-critic Greg Garrard on Beckett's ecological thought about Endgame as a kind of ecological piece of writing. And I like the idea of the humor there. I mean, when you mentioned the Anthropocene, you, Neil, were talking about just then, you both laughed because it's absurd. This idea, we've changed the world in this way, and yet we have no control over it. That's the crazy thing. Like, all you can do about that is kind of laugh. It's what Amitabh Ghosh calls this derangement. And I was interested in, what does that do to agency? And so, thinking about these two characters, I like that idea of thinking about generations of different ages, and that sense of climate change being a real generational thing, which I think is something that, Jessie, you kind of bring about in your book a little bit. That sense of, the kind of apportioning of blame that goes on around climate change. And Neil, as you were talking about earlier, that we feel we ought to do something, but it's for future generations. So if we don't really want it to be us that actually has to do anything. So yeah, I felt I could condense it down to just two people. Also, I just felt, for sort of realism's sake, I like that kind of sense of two people living, working together, and the kind of madness that comes out of that. I mean, they're called the old man and the boy, but they're probably only about, maybe 10, 20 years apart. But if you're just working with one other person and they're older than you, well, they're the old man and you're the kid, and you'll always be the kid for for as long as you're both alive. So I like that kind of, I like the kind of that intensity that you get with just two people.
And this wind farm is not a healthy farm. I mean, we're not talking about a thriving place that's providing energy for a happy world, are we? We're talking about something that's rotting away. Yeah,
I mean, this actually just came from kind of reading about all of the kind of engineering literature around wind farms. Yeah, the fact that the problem with offshore wind is that as soon as you build a wind farm, it starts being rusted away and degrading away. And so I just thought, the scale of the work that needs to be done to upkeep these kind of wind farms, and the fact that this is all, to go back to Niall's point about the economy, this job of work is in the hands of private companies. And, well, can private companies be relied upon to always put up the money to replace these things, to keep these things going in these kind of ways? So if they're no longer profitable. So yeah, I was interested in that. And also, I mean, there had to be some tension somewhere. So it was never going to be a perfectly working place.
Mm. So I'm going to come on to genre now and ask you a bit about that. And I've just got, it's funny you should mention Beckett, because I've got 3 lines from Line, actually, which are perfect Beckett, really, aren't they? It's just in case the line moves, just in case it moves, just in case it ever moves. That is Beckett. So when we talk about the literature of catastrophe, there are various genres that have grown up around it, and I wonder if I could ask each of you, firstly, whether you consider or did consider in the writing of your novels or in the conception of them that they are climate change novels, and also what you think of genres and whether you feel they fit into any genre or relate to any genre. Jessie.
I mean, obviously it's definitely a climate change novel, and I sort of did intend that, although I was thinking, I mean, I suppose I was trying to write, and I'm sure that this is kind of fairly universal, like I was trying to write much more about now than I was trying to write about the future. What I was thinking about was where we are now and what it feels to be at the point that we're at now, looking both forwards to what might happen, but also back to what has already happened, and feeling like, oh, blinked and here we are. I mean, I didn't think of it as a genre novel because I don't think that I tend to think about my writing in those terms anyway. I tend to, I write the book that I want to write. I'm extremely kind of boring and selfish, but and also because I've always read, whatever takes my fancy. I've never thought, right, I am a reader that reads like literary fiction and I don't read anything else, or I just read crime fiction. So it all of that feels like it's kind of grist, and when I started thinking about this book, it took on the shape that it had. Although I was also looking back very much to kind of nuclear novels. I think that
those disaster novels, and you made me go. You sent me back. You inspired me to go back and read On the Beach. Which, I have to say, what an amazing novel that is. I hadn't read it since the 1960s, and
yeah, I mean, it's a completely extraordinary novel, and it's such an extraordinary novel for someone to write who has otherwise just written kind of like slightly sort of overwrought romances. And I'm really, I think that is such a key to the level of fear that must have driven it, I think.
I've got a quote from that, which I ended up having to cut from my piece because Neville Shute sadly had to go because we didn't have the room for it. And it's just this fantastic line. And when the young naval officer who realizes that they're doomed. They're all doomed. And he says he's having a conversation with a scientist on the submarine that he's about to go away on, and he says, it's the end of the world. I haven't had to imagine anything like that before. And the ship scientist said, it's not the end of the world at all, it's the end of us. The world will go on just the same, only we shan't be in it. And the combination of those two things, I've never had to imagine anything like that before, and it's this, it'll just go on without us.
And I think like that seems to be very much kind of, I suppose, the crux of the problem in some ways about thinking about climate change, because you kind of, you're trying to, it's impossible to sort of fully comprehend the idea of one's own death. That's a very tricky thing to think about, and you tend to think about it in ways which sort of allow there to be an existence for something afterwards, even if it's only, everyone that you love and your lovely funeral that you're going to have, and all the music that's going to be played. And so to kind of try and imagine the end of all of the people and all of the memory is very difficult. But then it's like your mind kind of brings it back, or my mind brings it back onto myself. So then I'm thinking, but actually, am I just, is it just that it's impossible to imagine my own death? Is imagining kind of climate catastrophe more difficult, less difficult? It's hard to say.
Well, part of the point is that we're in the middle of the story. And most of our stories are end determined. So like Noah's Ark, you have the dove bringing the olive tree, which means that there are olive trees and doves. But we're looking at something which doesn't have any olive trees and doesn't have any doves at the end of it.
But also, like it kind of inherent in the idea of a story is that there is someone to tell it or to hear it after it's occurred. And if what you're trying to do is imagine a story in which there is not an afterwards, then it becomes kind of like extremely frightening. I think.
Now, you said something really interesting, which was that you felt that it was a story on the way to being Ridley Walker, which is Russell Hoburn's great novel, when everything has language has degraded so much that there's a sort of new primitivism. They don't even speak the same language that we would understand, because the concepts of objective relation to language have gone. But it's not there yet.
I thought about this quite a lot when I was reading Ben's book as well. I think it's, but also that the absolutely heartbreaking kind of centre of Ridley Walker is this idea that they know that there was something before, but they don't remember what it was, but they know that there was something bigger than them that has been lost. It's this kind of sense of this enormous loss of knowledge and understanding of the world, and they're surrounded by relics, but they don't know what they were for, and it's this sense that they are impoverished that I've always found kind of utterly heartbreaking about that novel.
But they're not, your characters haven't got there yet.
No, but that's the future. And I think that, so in my novel there's two sort of older teenagers, young adults, and then there's a boy who's sort of 4 when they first go to the High House, and then over the next sort of 2 summers things unravel, and he is much closer to being that kind of world. So he talks about the fact that he can't, that his older sisters talk about things that he just has no reference point for, and he doesn't understand the words that they're using, and he already feels kind of like a kind of presage of that sort of loss, I think.
But as well as being a sort of piece of apocalyptic fiction, really, isn't it? It is also a domestic novel, because it's very much about how they live their lives and how they cook their food and how they survive season to season.
Yeah, because it's also about how that kind of minute detail of domestic life both allows you to survive and also to some extent insulates you from having to think about the thing that you're surviving. You can kind of go on day to day for a very, very long time, if you're lucky, without necessarily having to face up to the reality. And what interests me is how that seems to be both a mercy and in itself a problem, I suppose.
Ben, since you mentioned Ben just then, talk a little bit about how you see your novel. Do you think of yourself as writing speculative fiction, dystopian fiction? I mean, apocalyptic fiction, or just climate change fiction, or none of the above?
I guess actually all of the above, really, in a way. I mean, certainly when I set out to write this because I was interested in climate change, and I think that it's important to think about that, and it's important to think about how, the stories that we can tell. I mean, to deal with this transition that we're going to have to go through as a species. And Jessie, when you said about your book being kind of on the way to Ridley Walker, I think those are the kind of books we need. And I think Neil, your book does this as well. Like, it's these books that are kind of getting on the way to somewhere else, because a lot of dystopian and apocalyptic fiction deals with a kind of an end point or a beyond an end point, but actually it's this transition point, the transition process that we need to address. There's a great he's very entertaining, an environmental philosopher called Timothy Morton, who some of you may have come across before, but he's does these wonderful talks about ecological thinking. But he said the problem with climate change is it's going to take a really long time, and it's going to be very boring and terrifying in equal measure. And that doesn't tend to make for great drama, just boring and terrifying. But
I think that's I think that's like such a good way of putting it, and such a kind of problem when writing about it is that it's not like there's a big bang and then everyone's like, oh god, the apocalypse has happened. It's just kind of, so at what point do you say, yes, this is the apocalypse now, and that seems to be, that's very much the point that we've reached, isn't it, in this,
and like, there may be a flood event, but that doesn't mean it's going to be the only flood event. It's an ongoing process. And so for me, I mean, I was interested in sort of tackling that problem. And Claire, you asked about like the two characters. I was interested in that, the boredom that you get, just with one other person around. And I mean the creative potential for boredom as well. There's a lot of creative potential in boredom. Writers spend a lot of time being bored, and I think that's where some of the best ideas come from. So I was interested in that. But I mean, I guess I didn't think too much about genre as I was writing it. I mean, mainly honestly, because I didn't necessarily think it was going to get published, because it was a pretty weird idea for a book anyway. And so I just thought, well, as Jessie said, just write the book that I would want to read. I mean, I thought a bit about, was doing lots of reading around dystopian fiction, apocalyptic fiction, more just to kind of make sure I was avoiding cliches as much as I could and making sure I was doing something new. So that I think it's more that was how much I was thinking about fiction, thinking about genre. But I'm happy really with people calling my book whatever they want. If they're buying it and reading it, I don't mind what they call it.
So Neil, you do boring in the first section, don't you? I mean, I don't mean that it is boring to read. I mean, they are in a state of ancestral boredom. They don't know how long they've been bored for. They're just standing in a queue, forever and ever and ever. But then you whoop it out of the boredom. You take them on a voyage into almost Game of Thrones.
I suppose, like Ben said, I was only interested in, like, I wasn't massively had genre in my head when I was doing it, but I was interested in genre insofar as that I didn't want to write something that was totally generic. I just wanted to write something that whatever genre it was a bit different. And I think, like Jessie and Ben said, I didn't really mind what people called it. Like, that wasn't at the forefront of my thinking. But one thing, and I think maybe this is like Doggerland and the High House as well, I was less interested in change and more interested in the mechanics of change, and how we were going to get to whatever, a barren world or a climate disaster. I was more interested in the process of that. So the idea that it's not going to be fabulously interesting, it's going to be this kind of long, slow demise, that's kind of like built into the first part of the book. But you can't do that. You need to have some dramatic tension at some point as well. But I was really interested, as I mentioned before, in the mechanics of the economy and how that was going to push us into some kind of changed world that we then had no control over. So you mentioned, with the climate, we're creating situations that are now out of our control. And I was kind of interested in the fact that we're creating economies which are totally constructed that we then can't control. Like the idea that you can't control the economy is totally strange if you think about it, because what is the economy? It's just people doing stuff. So why is it that it then becomes like a thing of itself that we end up trying to serve rather than something that's kind of a means to generate wealth or redistribute wealth?
So you have the corporation, and part of the key to getting out of this endless queue is the corporation handbook, and then you have the firm. What's it called? The firm, is it? What's it called?
The company. It's the
company, right? The corporation and the company. I was interested that you both very much have this sense that everything devolves to the man.
It's a bit conspiracy theorist, I suppose, isn't it? Philip K. Dick, Scanner Darkly kind of thing. I kind of stole the corporation from Joseph Conrad, because he has the company. You know, this is the nameless company that sends these people off into the Congo to, be civilized. So I was kind of interested in that idea. So like in line, when they leave line, they go to the pinnacle of civilization, which is this city, and you find out it's totally monstrous and barbaric. And the idea of like who's civilized here anyway, and who gets to decide, I found that quite interesting.
That's the English teacher in you coming out, the comparative literature. I'm very interested that The Heart of Darkness was one of, I hadn't spotted that actually, but actually now you say it, of course it makes absolute sense. It's relating, I mean, because where we are now in a way, in our fears about the unknown, relates very strongly to what Conrad was reflecting in his time about.
Yeah, I found... So I really like The Heart of Darkness, but I find it really problematic as well, you know, in terms of how it presents the Congo, you know, as this backwards, primordial, atavistic place. I found that idea of like this journey of the civilized into a dark center, I found that really interesting, and, you know, flipping that around. And I think this idea of what kind of journey we're going on now, you know, in terms of the climate, the economy, and, you know, what we're going to find at the heart of it, I think is quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. So this thing about being on the way seems to be in common. All your novels have in common, and I think that's one of the things that I found most interesting about all the novels that I found most interesting was it made me think that actually there's something about the dystopian novel, the classic dystopian novel, that's almost like cozy crime now, because it's such a familiar genre, and it's like we won't go, you know, we're not there, we're not going to ever be on Cormac McCarthy's road, we're not ever going to be, you know, it's like and what people talk about, the thrill of safe fear. It feels like that the actual dystopian novel's gone into that place, whereas what you three are doing is something more, it's scarier because it's more unknown. It doesn't have it doesn't touch all those bases. Do you think that's a fair thing to say?
Well, for me, I suppose you'd have to ask the readers. I suppose I wanted it not to be cozy. I wanted it to be jarring. Like, it can't just be like Dystopia 3 Schadenfreude. I don't think that works, you know, in terms of, you know, trying to jar the reader and trying to get some kind of response out of the reader, whatever that may be.
What about Ben? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think a very kind thing to say, Claire, about our books, definitely. I think that's certainly what I was aiming for with that. And I think that idea of as Neil talked about, the processes, and thinking about the capitalist processes, and the mechanical processes that will shape the future, I think, was something I was definitely very interested in my book, and then what that does to us and what that does to our agency as well. You know, whenever I'm teaching fiction to my students, I always talk about, you know, the importance of characters having a clear desire that then generate, you know, that's the engine for the plot. But what happens to people's agency when faced with something like climate change, which is all of our fault, but we all cause it, but we cause it in such seemingly insignificant ways. Our agency is so diffused, and what does that do then for the possibility of us as actors in our own stories? So that's something I was particularly interested in.
So now you're a university lecturer in creative writing. Have your students read it?
Yeah, look, they're very nice actually. Quite a few of them have read it and even bought it as well, which is very nice.
And do they feed back to you, or are they a bit intimidated?
No, all my students are very nice generally, so they only say nice things. I'm sure some of them probably do have criticisms
behind their hand.
Well, actually, what was very nice is I was teaching when my book came out. I had a student, one of my MA classes, who actually worked as an engineer on a wind farm, and so I suddenly got very nervous about him reading it, exposing my complete lack of any genuine knowledge about wind farms or engineering. But he said it was all very good, so that was the best feedback I could get.
That's pretty cool.
I'd read enough technical manuals to seem like I knew what I was talking about.
And do you see them writing this sort of novel? Is it?
Some do. I mean, quite a few students enjoy. Tend to enjoy kind of more classic dystopia, possibly because of that slightly escapist element to it, I think. But yeah, I think there are quite a few people writing about climate change, and it's a good thing, and good thing that people are exploring new forms and new ways of doing it.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that it's becoming more acceptable to write in? I mean, this is you're using tropes from genre. Do you think that it's becoming more respectable?
I think so. I mean, I find most writers I talk to, they don't feel, they wouldn't see it as a bad thing for their book to be labeled as being in any particular genre, in a way that perhaps 20, 30 years ago, if you were a literary fiction author and someone dared to say that your novel was in any kind of genre, you'd be appalled. But yeah, I mean, I think certainly students tend to they tend to take elements from different genres, and I mean that's something I always encourage them to do as well, because I think that's where you get the most interesting writing. It's just taking stuff from wherever you're interested in taking things from, and seeing how that works and how that goes together.
Mm-hmm. So another feature that I feel I'm very interested in is the way that your novels and a lot of the novels I've looked at in this area deal with the offstage. There's a sort of offstageness. I think so. Sometimes it's in parenthesis. It's about the natural world in parenthesis. Or I mean, in the High House, there are people around. They're vaguely aware of another life. There is other life going on, but it doesn't actually directly impinge. And obviously, in Line, it's this thing that exists beyond the line. I mean, is that something that you've thought about?
Sorry, go on, Jessie.
No, you go.
I just meant thought about in what regard, like putting something off stage.
About the fact that you have a story, but then you have other stories in the background that are not in. I mean, it just seems to be something that happens in this area of literature. That there are the stories that can't be told or can only partly be seen. Sometimes it's backstory, sometimes it's the natural world. In your case, it's the people who are pulling the strings.
I think there's some element. It's because disaster fiction, or whatever you want to call it, it captures the zeitgeist, and the zeitgeist changes. So in the 80s or whatever, it was nuclear apocalypse, and year 2000, it was the year 2000 bug shutting down everything. So I think you kind of have to leave that gap in a way, because the zeitgeist changes, but the fear of disaster doesn't change, if you know what I mean. So I don't know how Jessie or Ben feel about that.
You're about to say something.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that it felt very important when I was writing to have this idea that, because you're writing about the survivors, right? So or you're writing about the luckier people. So it felt very important that there was this idea, because the offstage is all of the people who are dead already or facing imminent death. And so when I was writing The High House, it felt very important to me that it was clear that the privilege of the characters that I was writing about, which is given to them by the stepmother, is their survival, although whether it's kind of absolute survival or whether it's only, it just allows them to be, you know, if you go back to the idea of climate apocalypse being an extremely long drawn out one, you know, it brings up the question of what it even means to be a survivor, or are you in fact just one of the last to go, you know. So I think, you know, that the offstage bit is where the disaster is happening. And I think, you know, again, we were talking about the fact that I felt very much that I was writing a domestic novel, and so they're all getting on with, you know, worrying about what they're going to eat for their tea, and outside the world is falling apart, because that's, unless you're in a position of tremendous power, that is pretty much how it does unravel, I think. And we've all seen that for the last, you know, two years, that the luckiest of us have been the ones that have been inside worrying about what to have for tea and how bored we are, and the actual disaster has been occurring elsewhere. I mean, it occurs elsewhere, unless what you're doing is writing about the kind of absolutely acute end of somebody's life, really. It's that thing of privilege and luck and power, and having the power to be insulated. I think all of those things come into play, and then. But
they don't know, do they? They just know that every now and then there are groups of people outside, but they're never attacked. There's never, you know, it doesn't ever become the road, or, you know.
Yeah, and I mean, I sort of did it about that, but then I suppose that the large part of the novel happens, you know, while things are unraveling rather than afterwards. So I wanted to leave open the idea that they're not, in fact, the last people, because possibly, you know, they're only halfway through the tide, you know, and elsewhere, you know, there are countries which are kind of earlier in the story, but then they can't, you know, you know, who do you help, really? Yeah.
Also a little bit leaving open the possibility of redemption.
Well, I don't think that, I don't think that there's much idea of there being potential redemption at the, I don't know, possibly.
But there's a possibility that something might come.
Yeah, except that's what would redemption look like? At that, like, it's not going to stop. You can't, once you've gone past a certain point, you know, it's not like, maybe someone's going to come from, I don't know, some very, very, like someone from the Himalayas and say, right, we've come in a helicopter and we're going to rescue you. Where are they going to take you? What is that life going to look like if everything else has already fallen apart? You know, it's possible that there's more to the story, but I don't know whether it would look like redemption.
Elon Musk could come along with a space rocket and take you off to the moon.
Yeah, but it's horrible on the moon.
Would that be redemption? Yeah. Punishment, yeah.
It's not going to be nice. It's just going to be being on the moon, not having anything to eat on the moon, rather than
with Elon Musk. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Or Richard Branson, take your pick.
Oh God, you're making it worse.
So Ben, you have, you know, what is happening outside this wind turbine station? Where do these goods come from that are exchanged? Where does the pilot get them from?
Yeah, it's interesting that. Yeah, I think interesting hearing Jessie and Neil talk about this, and it's always a question with I think climate fiction, or indeed lots of dystopian fiction, about that sense of the offstage. And I did think about going into more detail with that, about what the company was like. I even actually did think about having the boy actually leaving the wind farm at some point and going off elsewhere. I think the problem with that is that, that issue of wanting to write something new and different. I mean, well, we kind of all know what the world's going to look like. I don't think I've got anything, you know, seeing me write it down, I don't think will help at all. Just seeing me play that, you know, you've all seen like the movies, you've all seen the news reports. We've all read Margaret Atwood and all those other writers who've kind of explored these areas in really fascinating ways. So actually, I kind of just wanted to leave that as as imaginative space. I mean, also, I'm quite glad I did as well, because I mean, my book came out on the kind of eve of Brexit. And I think probably my idea was some sort of European superstate or something like that. So that would have immediately, as you said, Neil completely dated my book before it was even published. So, but that's why I sort of assumed the world would be like. So yeah, I kind of intentionally left it that, because as a writer, you kind of want the book to be relevant, hopefully in 10, 20 years. Whereas any description of that, I think would immediately date it. So I hope the reader can just kind of imagine what that would be like, and leaving that as kind of imaginative space. I always like imaginative space in novels, where you just get to imagine, what it's like going on there, until they make a terrible sequel movie, filling in all the gaps so there's no imagination left in the world.
And one of the things that a friend of mine who's a novelist whose characters tend to be passive, and he was saying they always want to make them into action heroes, and it ruins it, because you cannot in a film have a passive character at the center of a film, whereas at a novel that often is what makes a novel so interesting. So one of the issues, and Jessie's touched on it in all these, is the issue of energy. What happens? How do you generate energy? What happens? And in different ways, all these novels deal with it, most radically in line. And we've been very discreet about what happens in the plot of Line, but I have to say that one of the image that it will leave me is the image of a sort of resourceless driven data capitalism, which has become so starved of anything outside itself that actually all it can feed itself on is human flesh. So it's all it can do is devour itself. Is that a correct reading, Neil? It's absolutely Gaussian. It's absolutely my nightmare. That is my nightmare.
It's probably not a very subtle metaphor that the capitalist system eats the people, I suppose, in retrospect.
But it's also a literal I mean, it's not. It is a metaphor.
But it is literal, like the buildings absorb them. I was listening to a podcast or something on Radio 4, and it was about cities in really hot countries that have kind of forsaken traditional ways of building that would keep people cool, to build kind of modern Western glass towers and then cool them with air conditioning. But air conditioning is taking so much energy from these cities that maybe don't really have good energy systems and grids, that if the air conditioner doesn't work, the people can't live in them. Because what it's like to live in a top of a big high-rise building in London. Imagine in a place that's 55 degrees. So you've got people, then the air conditioning stops and they have to go get in their car or something. And it's this idea that we've got rid of something that was cheap, almost free, probably not free, and worked, to build something really massively energy expensive that doesn't work very well. For why? It was so that kind of idea. Yeah, I think energy and our kind of attitudes toward it's as if, we'll always have power to plug in the aircon, but obviously, that's not really the case, is it?
But I mean, it's interesting you mentioned aircon, because aircon is a thing that features in post-colonial literature. A lot of, I mean, it's in several of the Indian novels and Pakistani novels I've read over the last 20 years, because and has the metaphorical power, because it's putting cold air in, but the price of that is it's pushing hot air out.
Yeah, well, there's no such thing as a free lunch. That's the famous economics phrase. Like, you're getting cold air, someone else is getting hot air in your face. Someone's getting screwed somewhere. When you get a free delivery from Amazon, it's not free for someone. That knock-on effect. And I think that's very linked to climate change. We want everything now. We want it quick. But, we've got these zero energy, zero carbon commitments or whatever. But what they're doing, a lot of countries, rich countries, can't afford it. They're outsourcing their carbon production or whatever, so they're just paying another country to take it and then saying, it's fine, we're zero carbon. That's not solving the climate crisis. That's just abrogating your responsibility because you're rich enough to get away with it.
I think we've become so, in the last kind of 50 to 100 years, here in this country and similar countries, very, very wealthy countries, we've become so divorced from that kind of energy economy that we've forgotten that it existed. Like, so when I was writing this book, and I'm talking about me as much as anyone else, like when I was writing this book, we had just moved to Northumberland and we did not have any central heating. And the amount of energy that we had to spend every day just to keep the fire going, because if it went out, it was brutally cold in the winter. And the children were sort of sitting in the kitchen in their duvets, breathing out clouds of steam because the kitchen was sub-zero. And there's like ice all over the windows, and we're having to get up. The first thing we do in the morning is get up and light the fire, and then you have to not let the fire go out. So if you're going to go out if you're going to go out anywhere, you have to think, have I got time to go out and get and get back again before it goes out? Because if it goes out, then you've got to relight it. And just it's like we've forgotten that kind of metric exists, and the idea that you can just kind of flick a switch and then the lights come on and the house is hot. But that energy is coming from somewhere. There is a cost, but we've become so used to it. It's become so ubiquitous that we've forgotten what that cost is, other than your energy bill that comes. You sort of if you're lucky, you can pay that. And clean clothes, like the idea that you shouldn't wear a pair of trousers twice, because heaven forfend that your pair of trousers might be slightly grubby or smelly, but it costs something to keep washing everything constantly. We're absolutely outsourcing these things to to places that often places that we have a colonial history with, where we can say those people are resources too, we can use them, we can that they're expendable to some extent in order to keep us.
It brings me to, it's something that John Lanchester said. John Lanchester, who wrote a very good dystopian novel a couple of years ago, The Wall. He said this, and I was interviewing him at Hay, and he said the science hasn't changed. It's just that we haven't listened to it. The science has been there for the last 50 years. It hasn't changed, but we haven't listened to it. Therefore, we're sort of nearer the end play. Ben, the energy in your novel is all human, basically, isn't it? Because the wind farm is not working, basically, and that's so it's almost like an absolute reversal, that they are constantly on the move, having to take very technically detailedly describe bits of machinery out and move them around in order to keep going a diminishing stock of these ancient rusting windmills.
I was kind of interested in that sense that Jessie and Niall have just been talking about, that no energy is free, and even renewable energy isn't free as such, in that these things have to be maintained. They have to be they have to be looked after. This infrastructure has to be looked after. I was just interested in that, and that sense of perhaps that sense of scale. Thinking about, well, what does one of those wind turbines power? How much power is it sending back to the mainland? This, each repair that they make, how much does that help? If we're thinking about our overall emissions and overall energy consumption, it's something that, Jessie, as you were saying, as modern Western individuals, we don't tend to think about. It's something we don't have to think about until you live somewhere that actually your only source of heat is a fire, or something like that. But it was interesting what you were saying about the technology not having changed, Claire, or the science not having changed. Because I was also I did an event a while ago with a climate scientist, Corinne Le Carré, and she was saying that actually all of the technology exists to completely solve climate change if we want to. What doesn't exist is the political will, or it's wrapped up in other bigger systems, like, as you were saying, Niall, the economy, because the economy is so based around oil and gas that it almost can't factor renewable energy in. So that was kind of what I was thinking about when I was writing the book, that sense that the technology can be there, but if you don't actually have the will to use it, or the system isn't right to be able to use it, then that's what needs to change.
And there's a lovely thinking about the edifices of fiction builds, and particularly in these books. There's one of the sort of revelatory bits for me in Line was when they move out of the line, and only by moving out of the line did they realise the line is not going in a straight line. It's going in a circle, because they don't have a perspective. When they're in the line, they don't have a perspective. And again, I thought that was a brilliant touch, because it's so, you sort of put it in, it's so matter of fact and light. And she's saying, yeah, that's exactly right. That's where we are. We're in a line. We don't know whether it's going around in a circle, which it is probably, or if it's going in a straight line, which is the fiction of progress.
Yeah, it was the fiction of, like, I guess, combat economic growth. Like, you can't just keep growing your economy forever. You know what I mean? So
be able to triangulate where you are in order to, so i.e. you have to have a perspective in order to work out whether actually there is such a thing as progress.
Yeah, or whether, like, progress isn't in itself inherently good. It's only good if it, like, raises people's standards of living or makes your life better. It's not progress for progress' sake. And it's the same with the line. You don't just keep moving for the sake of keep moving. Well, they do, because they don't know anything else, but that becomes a bit of a solipsistic way to exist. So, like, I think we've got these fallacies about progress and growth, like they become ends in themselves, which we lose perspective. They're actually means to make our lives better. We're like, oh no, we can't spend money on housing poor people, we have to grow the economy. Well, what the hell is the economy for if it's not to put people in houses? Well, why are we bothering?
Mm-hmm.
But
okay, go on, Jessie.
Very quickly, that kind of progress thing comes back to energy again, because if you're talking about, progress is making quality of life better, like, in order for our quality of life to get better, somebody somewhere, it has to get worse. Like that, that there's got to be an energy in and energy out. Like, this is the thing. There's got to be a balance. Or you say, okay, well, everyone has to have a basic kind of decent standard.
Yeah.
That means that somebody's going to have to get worse, and that's probably going to be us, really. Which is, that's the truth to face. Sorry.
or as John Lanchester said, it's probably not going to be us. It's going to be some child on the equator who's yet to be born.
Yeah,
who will not have the possibility of life anymore. And
I mean, were we to try and fix this right now and say we need to work out what the kind of medium level is that we can keep everyone going at? Yes, the people at the bottom are going to be raised up, but we are going to have to give up a hell of a lot to get, to go down to that. And that's that's always going to be the problem, isn't it? The willingness to do that.
Okay, so I'm going to start asking people to start putting in questions, things you want to ask questions, but I'm going to now dob in the $1 million question, which is, why are we bothering to write fiction about this? Because it's boring and terrifying, and it's best left to the scientists. Discuss.
Well, I mean, actually, if you speak to climate scientists, they want writers and artists to be engaging with this, because they're like, well, we told you the science and you're not doing anything. So, and the technology's there. What isn't there is I think what isn't there is an imaginative system in which to put this in, to enact this. We don't know. This is why it's near future fiction is so important, because we have to be able to think about alternative ways of living and alternative ways of being, and that's a process of storytelling. So, yeah.
You do both agree with that?
I'd probably say I do agree, but I'd probably, in response to the question, take a slightly different line in that, like, you don't just measure fiction by its utility. We're not just writing to make people do stuff. I mean, that would be a fairly narrow parameter to write fiction, I'd say. So.
Yeah, and I think that they're both much better answers than mine, which is that I'm just really anxious, and and that to go somewhere, and this is my that's where I put it, and so I mean, I'd like to say that I'd written it to try and change the narrative, but actually it was just because I'm really frightened, and I didn't know what to do, so this is what I did.
Well, one of the answers that I have to that question, which is very contested. I was talking to the novelist John Banville about a different subject. Actually, I was talking to him the other day about fiction of the art of 9/11, and he was saying art cannot deal with something immediate things or awful things that have happened, it is not equipped to do that. It becomes kitsch. He was talking particularly about literature of conflict, but then a colleague of mine, young colleague of mine, Arifa Akbar on The Guardian, wrote a memoir about her sister. Was inspired by her sister's death. Her sister died a couple of years ago from tuberculosis, undiagnosed until the day of her death, although she said if you were to look back through operas, 19th century operas and novels, she had all the symptoms that they were writing about, all the symptoms in La Bohème and La Traviata, just an absolute classic, but they didn't diagnose it. Saying, how is it that they didn't diagnose it? And she goes, and there are all sorts of very murky questions because they're a Muslim family. Was it racism? Was it blah, blah, blah? She ends up going to a sort of very eminent professor who says, the thing is, in order to diagnose something, you have to have a suspicion. And until you have a suspicion, you don't see it. and I just thought that was such a brilliant summary of why it's really important that we tell stories, is that until you've created the possible scenario, you don't see what's going on. So now I've got a question from Brian, actually. Brian, hooray! Is data capitalism a real threat or just a metaphor? So I guess that's one for Niall.
Yeah, I think it's a big real threat. If you look at what happened in the American election, with the Cambridge Analytica or whatever, it turned out they were getting this reams of data, and they weren't just like using it to target voters for them. They were actively using it to highlight people who are less likely to vote and then stop them going out to vote. It's like anti-democracy. Like that's fucked up. Like, that is not a good way to be using data. And it will and then you had everything with like Brexit, like it's still a bit murky, but data capitalism was used there. So yeah, I think it is a real threat.
Is this something either of you others have thought about?
I mean, I guess in relation, thinking about the way that climate scientists are often discredited, but I remember when I was at university, there was the big scandal about the emails around from the UAA climate scientists that were kind of bandied around the right-wing press and to kind of discredit this and just the use of data for misinformation as well, in the same way that was used with Brexit, used with the US election, and just misinformation about it. It's very easy to mislead people around complex issues because all you have to do is say, don't listen, just don't really pay attention. And these are very complex issues. So that it is a real threat, certainly.
If anybody wants to just come in and unmute yourself, put your hand up, and if the idea of leaving a chat question is intimidating, please do so. Do join in. Don't feel shy, because there isn't going to be a bookshop to continue the conversation afterwards, which is what usually happens in my experience at literary sessions. People come rushing up afterwards saying, the question I really wanted to ask was, and you just think, oh, for goodness sake, why didn't you ask it in the session? But before everybody rushes to do that, what other novelists do you have particular novelists you're interested in, whose work you're interested in, that you would recommend? I mean, I would certainly recommend Amitav Ghosh. Jessie.
I hate this question, I really do, because I've got a terrible memory, and as soon as anyone asks me anything like that, I can't.
It all goes straight out of your head. Well, we've got Neville Shute from you for starters, and I have to say,
absolutely,
it was absolutely brilliant thing to read, partly because it sort of gave a sense of the difference, but even though what he's talking about is it's taking 6 months for this nuclear threat to actually wipe out the whole population. It's a slow 6 months, but 6 months is nothing compared to what we compared to what we've got now.
But yeah, so I think that the thing about the Neville Shute book is that so there's been a nuclear event in the Northern Hemisphere, and the people it's set in Australia, and they are there, they're waiting for the fallout to reach them. So they're waiting for this cloud to block out the sun effectively and kill them all. And they know it's coming, and there's nothing that they can, I mean, at the beginning there is a small amount of hope, but there very quickly becomes no hope that they will be able to do anything about this. And I think that that's the thing that's so extraordinary about it as a book, is that it just is absolutely kind of shut down to the possibility of there being a future, but people kind of continue to act to some extent as if there is going to be, for a really long time, until pretty much the last possible moment. And actually, like, I haven't reread it for a very long time. I read it as a teenager. My grandmother had she had a whole line of Neville Shute novels, and I used to go there every summer, and I would like read my way through, like all of her Agatha Christie, and there was a summer and I did Neville Shute, and I'd read A Town Called Alice, and all the way through. And then suddenly I read this book, and it just kind of absolutely floored me. And then about 10 years later, I woke up in the middle of the night and I couldn't sleep, so I turned the radio on, and there was an adaptation of it, and I was sort of just lying in the dark, kind of up, like, again, kind of utterly horrified by it. So yeah, I recommend that.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so I've got a question from Stephen. We can come back to this. Stephen.
Yeah, I've tried to do it with the chat, but it didn't seem to send it. So, but that's what I was asking. Do you think your books will actually help people who read them to come to the understanding that this is a personal and immediate problem? I think you partly answered it, because you've all talked about it being a long process, but there is some thought in the climate change world, shall we say, the scientists, that things could slowly start, but then accelerate and happen extremely quickly. So it could become essentially tomorrow in some respects. I mean, we've seen some of the big changes this year, totally different than the smaller changes we've had over the last 10 years. It's on a totally different scale. And next year, they could be on 2, 3, 4, 5 times the scale this year. So you talked about it being a slow process, but it can actually be quite a big process. And people need to see that as an immediate possibility. It's an immediate process.
Yeah, that is an interesting point. We had we have these away days on The Guardian every now and then, and we had one a couple of years ago, and the guy who set up Extinction Rebellion came and talked to us, and he was like an Old Testament prophet, really, just sort of utterly terrifying, but had this sort of slightly crazed look in his eyes, and I think we probably weren't quite used to this sort of way of talking. And at the end of the two things that came out of it were, at the end of it, our editor said to us, and there were sort of all the heads of department from different departments, I want you to, and he'd gone, to say how, go to one end of the room or the other end of the room, depending on whether you think, if you go to the right, you're saying science can fix it. If you're going to the left, you're saying science can't fix it. We need to take, there needs to be direct political action now as a matter of urgency. And the entire room, all the journalists in The Guardian, went to the left. All of them, including the science and environment journalists, went to the left. The only people who were sort of hovering around the middle were the lawyers. And then the second question was he right? He was talking about 10 years. He was saying we've got 10 years to fix this. And our environment boys, and this was 3 or 4 years ago, said the one thing that was actually misleading was he's talking 10 years, but actually it's more like 30 years, they said. But the thing is, you can't make people listen to 30 years. People don't understand 30 years. From the point of view of publicity or propaganda, you have to talk about 10 years because that brings it within their comprehension. Yeah. That was a moment for me. Just sort of totally changed my way of thinking about the whole thing.
I'll be quite honest. I'll be quite honest. I'm in my 70s now. And I first became aware of climate change. I was very involved in politics, left-wing politics, in the 70s. And it started to be talked about then. And I'm also aware that a lot of climate change, to some extent, and environmental change has already happened on smaller scales. I mean, you live in Eyemouth in Scotland. 300 years ago, there's 250,000 people lived in the Highlands of Scotland. Now there's 20,000, 30,000. And it's a degraded environment because of sheep and deer. And you look at 50 years ago, I can remember driving to the south coast when I was living in London. I was totally shocked by the destruction of the south wold, the weald and the wold with farming. Now, there's 6 inches at most soil on clay uplands. And these were all ploughed up. So everything was white, destroyed. Totally.
Well, Stephen, do you think writing books about that is the best thing?
I was just thinking, what's your thoughts about the books you've written and your immediate thoughts about?
I think personally, I wouldn't be so hubristic to think that my book is going to change large scale action. So it's probably, as Jessie said, I was more giving voice to my own anxieties rather than trying to propel change. But I don't know what Jessie or Ben think.
I mean, I definitely felt that was the sort of thing that I was trying to specifically write about. You know, like I absolutely first became aware of kind of the environment and climate as an issue, you know, in the 80s watching Newsround, you know, and then it was CFCs and the ozone layer and everyone had to save the whales. And, you know, and if we didn't do that, then at some point in the future, you know, the climate was going to start to deteriorate. And there's this kind of extraordinary feeling of looking back and thinking, I don't know how we got here from there. Like what were we doing? What have we been doing for the last, you know, 35 years? What have I been doing? You know, that kind of feeling of sort of, I mean, I'm not even quite sure what the word for it is, like this sort of really extraordinary vertigo, I think. And how, what is it inside ourselves that allows that to happen, that allows us to say, oh, we've got time, we can sort this out, right up until the point that our feet are underwater. You know, it's like we can comprehend an explosion, right? There's going to be a big bang, and afterwards everything is different. But what we can't do is sort of watch a gradual acceleration and call a time on it and say now this is a disaster. It's like, oh, it's, you know, it will be a disaster when this happens, and then you get to that bit and you say, oh, it's still not quite a disaster.
Could get worse. Yeah,
you move that point forward, and as you keep going, you keep kind of using these resources that we've acknowledged, and then suddenly there you are, knee deep in water.
So what do you go on to do after this? And I'm not completely abandoning the question about what writers we should be reading. What do you go on to write after you've written these novels? Do you go on to write jolly, cheerful novels about how we're not, you know, or do you continue exploring this vein? Is there any other subject that would be worthy now to write about? I'm going to ask Ben. I'll land you.
I've been working on a project the last few months with an artist creating maps of the Anthropocene. I've always been interested in maps and mapping, and so kind of maps and sort of fictional travelogues of the Anthropocene, because of how the landscape's changing. And these are changes that you know, even if, well, especially if we're able to solve climate change, that will involve large scale changes to the way we live on the planet. And so I think that's what I'm kind of interested in. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of shorter pieces and it's much more distanced pieces, I think.
Are they linked? It's fiction?
It's fiction, yeah, but yeah, fictional pieces.
Well, this is something that we haven't talked about, which I'm fascinated by, is the idea of fragments. And the Olga Tokarczuk, who's the Polish Nobel laureate, who became Nobel laureate. I can't remember which year it was because they gave 2 in the same year, whether it was 2018 or 2019. Anyway, in that batch, she says, we can only tell stories in fragments now and in fragments we can collect up meanings. And I feel that, well, Jenny Offill's Weather being the most obvious one, that there's a lot of writing in fragments at the moment, and then maybe that is partly one response to it is, you know, we cannot hope to tell the full picture now.
Yeah.
It's
I mean,
very postmodern, isn't it?
yeah.
That idea.
Yeah, and as Jessie and Neil were both talking about, the fact that this is a global, it's a global issue, and it is a global story, and there's always that problem of perspective, especially for me as a middle class white bearded man. Who am I to tell this global story? And so, I mean, Fragments is about as much as I feel confident writing at the moment about it, maybe.
But if you're looking at, like, in the history of literature, if you saw like postmodernism as a reaction to the absurdity of 2 world wars, then you could make a case to say you've got this climate postmodernism in reaction to the absurdity of the situation that Jessie mentioned, that we all know it's going to happen, but everyone is looking at someone else going, you do it, because I don't want to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, I think that we're going to have to wrap up now because it's just about past. But I just want to leave with a sort of something, a sort of gesture towards the fact that actually, as well as the science not being new, in a way, this theory is not absolutely new, and it's with a quote from Ursula Le Guin, the great Ursula Le Guin, in 1988, and when she proposed what she called the carrier bag theory of fiction, replacing what she described as the story of mammoth hunters told about bashing, thrusting, raping, killing, about the hero. And she said she wanted it to be replaced with the novel as a sack, a bag. A book holds words, words hold things. They bear meaning and bear meanings. A novel is a medicine bundle holding things in a particular powerful relation to one another and to us. And I just think that is a brilliant way of formulating what actually as somebody who doesn't write fiction, partly because more extremely than Neil, I can never actually bring myself to sit down for longer than it takes to write 1,200 word feature. That is what I think what literature does, and what your novels all have done for me. Thank you, all 3 of you, and please do continue. Long may you go on. Brian, over to you.
Thanks, Claire. And that's tremendous. That's been fantastic hour and a half. I'm sure I speak for everyone watching tonight when I thank Claire for handling the whole thing so expertly and gracefully. Thanks very much, Claire. And I'd like to thank our 3 authors for being with us tonight. They've been really generous with their time and their insights and their energy in addressing this issue. You'll find their books and other related titles online in our Two Rivers reading list. So do think about getting into a bookshop and buying some, in particular, of course, Ben Smith's Doggerland, Jessie Greengrass's High Water, and Niall Bourke's Line. So thanks to everyone tonight. It's been a tremendous privilege to have you all here, and thanks for listening, and see you, I hope, again later this week. Good night.
Bye.